We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the gas price explosion and raging inflation, a number of commentators have made the comparison between the presidencies of Joe Biden and Jimmy Carter. Now, is this a fair description? Well, we're back with Tim Donner providing a unique perspective on the life and times of the 39th president. Now, Tim, it's normal to compare current presidents with their predecessors. What similarities do you see between Carter and Biden?
Well, I think particularly from the point of Afghanistan forward, that Biden has been perceived as, let's put it this way, a president who could be taken advantage of by foreign powers. And I think we saw, Joe Biden is getting a lot of kudos for going to Ukraine and standing with President Zelensky. But at the same time, if you look during the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, Putin made no moves on Ukraine. He had moved on Georgia during the Bush 43 administration. He had moved on two other places, including a part of Ukraine during the Obama administration, but he behaved himself during the Trump years. I think it's not a coincidence that the moment that Trump left office and Biden became president, that the Russians began a military buildup on the Ukrainian border. And likewise, in 1979, there was clearly the sense that the Russians perceived Carter as weak, and why wouldn't they? Americans did. So the Soviets picked up on that very quickly, and they invaded Afghanistan. That, in turn, forced Carter, in his mind, to boycott the Olympics, and he had no real response other than verbally. And the sense was he was sort of in over his head. And the same thing has been said of Biden for different reasons, because of age and a cognitive decline, and the general sense, given all the gaffes that he makes, that he's just kind of barely keeping it together. And it was the same with Carter, even though he was a young, energetic, and well-liked president. But there was a clear sense that he was in over his head. And I think that was probably typified by when he gave the so-called malaise speech during the last full year of his presidency, in which he essentially blamed the American people for a crisis of spirit and sort of shed the blame from himself for the myriad problems that he had, which were on the foreign front. Most prominently beyond Afghanistan, of course, was the hostage crisis, and so many people felt he needed to end it, no matter the cost of human life to the American hostages. Other people admired him for his persistence in insisting that not a single hostage die, and ultimately they might call it a success, because the moment that he turned the keys to the Oval Office over to Ronald Reagan, the hostages were released. So there's just a sense, I think, too, that, Biden is a guy that the Democrats turned to because there was nobody else. And I think by the time Carter was elected, a lot of his flaws had already sort of been unmasked during the general election campaign in 1976. But Gerald Ford had pardoned Richard Nixon and was behind by 20 points. And so Carter barely held on. And the conventional wisdom at the time, among those people like myself who studied this stuff closely, was if the election had gone on another week, Carter would have lost because all the momentum was with Ford. But the presidencies compare in the sense that they are, a response to something dramatic that happened right before them. Joe Biden was a response to Donald Trump and the hatred that maybe 40 to 45% of the country had, the vile hatred for Trump. The same way that set the stage for Biden to sort of claim that he'll bring a return to so-called normalcy. Likewise, Jimmy Carter promised a return to normalcy from the stink of the Watergate affair and the Richard Nixon resignation. So, I think there are clear similarities, and we'll find out if Biden runs for re-election, whether the similarities run to a lack of success in seeking re-election.
I think there's certainly a major difference in terms of how presidents are portrayed through the media. Now, certainly we have had yellow journalism, as it's called, for a very, very long time. But the modern iteration, it appears to be all absolving and not shy of a little revisionist history when it comes to the facts. Now, how do you think this modern age journalistic machine will view Jimmy Carter?
It's a complicated legacy because, I mean, his flaws were obvious. You don't have to dig too deep to see the flaws in terms of a general lack of leadership, weakness in foreign policy, an inability to react to an economic crisis, a multi-level economic crisis. At the same time, one of the things few people realize is that the military buildup that was credited to, and rightly, Ronald Reagan during his 8 years, which led to basically the destruction of the Soviet Union. That it was actually begun by Jimmy Carter in 1980 in response to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. So he deserves at least some credit in reacting realistically to the Soviet threat. At the same time, he did some very good regulatory things in streamlining government, trying to make it more efficient, trying to cut the bureaucracy. And he was opposed as much by his own swamp-dwelling party as he was by Republicans in many sense. His problem was that his support during the campaign was what we call a mile wide and an inch deep. People supported him, just like Biden. They supported him. They were going to vote for him because he was not the other person. But when he became president, that didn't give him much of a stronghold, and he came marching into Washington with his own people. Hamilton, Jody Powell, those are the two most famous of the Georgia mafia, so to speak, that he brought in to Washington, and they just refused to cooperate with the swamp. Again, like Trump, he had his own ideas of zero-based budgeting, for example, where the government would be brought to a zero budget and be forced to defend every penny they spent. Unfortunately, he had so many proposals that there was an inability to focus on a larger question. He didn't have an Obamacare, for example, where Obama focused all the attention on that single initiative to try and get it done, and he succeeded. With Carter, there were 100 different things he was trying to do, but there wasn't any one thing that he could lead the American people to. He will go down as, I think, in history, there's no question, as he did mostly at the time, putting together a remarkable peace deal between Egypt and Israel, Sadat and Begin. And of course, Anwar Sadat wound up sacrificing his life for it because he was later assassinated. That was an extraordinary accomplishment, and one that took the kind of detail-oriented person, tireless kind of person like Carter, shuttling back and forth, shuttle diplomacy between the two leaders at Camp David in order to get the deal done. And that set the framework for, again, with Trump, what later became the Abraham Accords.
Yeah, the David Accords to the Abraham
yes.
Accords. Yeah. Yep. Okay, Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for your insight. Much appreciated.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, Mark.
Later in the show, we talk Liberty with Scott D. Cosenza. But up next, after this short break, we discuss the coming nuclear arms race. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.